What do we know about the so-called causes of terrorism? What drives some people away from conventional political, religious, or ideological thoughts and beliefs towards violence? What makes one person more or less likely to join terrorist groups? These are some of the big questions for terrorism scholars, and they are anything but easy to answer. But in this video, we're going to try to do our best to theorize about some of the causes of terrorism and terrorist activity. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get started. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I am a criminologist studying discourses and practices of terrorism and counter-terrorism. On this episode, we are going to attempt to answer one of the big foundational questions in the field of sociology of terrorism. What do we know about the causes of terrorism? Is it simply about individual psychopathy, where folks are suffering from mental health issues that stimulate antisocial behavior? Is it purely a political response to perceived grievances? Or is it nothing more than hate for a particular group of people or a desire for power? Part of the challenge we have in trying to answer these questions stems from difficulties defining what terrorism is in the first place. Most of us approach terrorism as an issue that manifests at the micro or individual level, or most broadly at the group level. This causes us to only focus on terrorism as an action taken out by individuals, small groups, or in the broadest sense, large-scale national or multinational groups categorized as terrorist entities. The problem with this is that we miss other forms of political violence that can and perhaps should be considered in this same analytic gaze. What is the difference between terrorism and modern warfare, for instance? How do you distinguish terrorism from war when the violence is being conducted by a state actor? The truth is, there is not one singular cause or even pathway towards terrorism. Not only does terrorism mean something different to different groups of people, organizations, and state actors, but the motivations that drive folks to commit political violence are very different depending on who you ask. One of the really fundamental problems in the field of terrorism studies has been the inability to adequately define terrorism. Different actors have very different ideas about what is terrorism and how it should be defined. A critical sociologist of terrorism, for instance, might view terrorism as a social construction conjured up by state actors to expand legal powers and criminalize groups of people. Government officials, on the other hand, tend to view terrorism through a realist lens. That is, that terrorism is an objective fact as part of an objective reality and must be prevented through the expansion of law, surveillance, and intelligence, which necessitate a formalized legal definition in order to police terrorism. That formalized legal definition might be very different than how other governments define terrorism, or how so-called terrorist groups perceive or view terrorism. The saying one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter is a useful analogy here. Who gets to define the boundaries of what a terrorist or terrorist organization is, and how does that influence political, cultural, and legal understandings? That is why it is very important for sociologists to be very specific and concrete about how they define terrorism. It is both an ontological and, perhaps more importantly, a methodological question that sociologists must address in their research studies. In Canada, for example, Section 83 of the Criminal Code stops short of defining terrorism as an offense per se, and instead defines terrorist activities as an act or omission undertaken inside or outside of Canada for a political, religious, or ideological purpose that is intended to intimidate the public with respect to its security, or compel a person, government, or organization from doing or refraining from doing any act, and that intentionally causes harm. This definition is very different than the FBI's definition of international terrorism, defined as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups who are inspired by or associated with designated foreign terrorist organizations. or its definition of domestic terrorism as violent criminal acts committed by individuals and/or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. In all of these examples, critical sociologists might question who gets to decide what a political, religious, or ideological purpose is. Who gets to define the limits of a designated foreign terrorist organization? How does a group get designated, or equally important, how it does not get designated, as a terrorist organization, or in Canada as a terrorist entity? These are fundamental questions for us as scholars, and we must grapple with them in our analysis of how terrorism is understood in the social world. But because there is not one universal definition of terrorism, models that purport to explain the root causes of terrorism, or even the pathway towards terrorism, sometimes called radicalization models, are fundamentally limited to a specific context, and perhaps even a specific individual or group. The idea of root causes of terrorism suggests that there is some form of causal relationship between underlying social, economic, political, and demographic conditions or characteristics and terrorist activity. According to this line of thinking, certain underlying conditions and grievances help to explain how, where, and why terrorism occurs. A failure to understand those underlying causes, then, is said to cause ineffective and inadequate counterterrorism strategies and policies. And conversely, an approach to counterterrorism that ignores the relationship between underlying conditions and terrorism may actually exacerbate the issues and intensify the threat. For many, this root cause model has some intuitive appeal. There's some appeal to being able to identify the underlying conditions that predict terrorism so that you can prevent it. However, because terrorism is itself a contested domain that is fundamentally difficult to define, and because individual and group pathways towards terrorism are incredibly contextual and specific, very little has actually been offered empirically by the root cause model. In other words, the causes that drove folks to attack New York and Washington on 9/11 are very different than the ones that drove Anders Breivik to attack a day camp on Utoya Island in Norway. And we must analyze each of these cases with the acceptance of those differences in mind. Definitional issues aside for a moment, answering the question of why an individual might commit terrorism is very different than why a state might sponsor or endorse it, or why a group like ISIS engages in political violence compared to, say, a group like the Proud Boys. Even at the most micro level of analysis, it is hard to compare the causes and motivations of someone like Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, the infamous Columbine mass shooters, to the Tsarnaev brothers who attacked the Boston Marathon. The causes, motivations, and justifications for why individuals and groups decide to commit terrorist activities are complex, broad, and numerous, and cannot be reduced to a single pathway model, as some within the field have suggested is possible. But just like many things in the social world, there are patterns, trends, and tendencies that emerge across large populations that we can indeed identify, collect information about, analyze, and understand. And that is the reason why sociologists, as well as others in the field of terrorism studies, attempt to identify the so-called causes of terrorism. Just like anything else in the social world that causes harm or deviates from the perceived norms, sociologists are interested in identifying why some follow status quo norms and others deviate from them, even if no singular cause or pathway can be found. But like many things, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the 20 years of the maligned war on terror since, many observers suggest that it is not useful to address the root causes of terrorism. Terrorism, for them, is the symbol of everything wrong in the world and inherently evil and must therefore be totally destroyed. Understanding its causes is sympathetic to them and therefore unnecessary and perhaps even unethical. Others argue that we must focus on the set of social and psychological symptoms that indicate so-called radicalization towards terrorism. And we must treat terrorism much like a doctor treats symptoms of illness. A number of folks even suggest that there are specific structural root causes of terrorism: poverty, globalization, consequences of settler colonialism and Orientalism, that if addressed would solve the problem of terrorism. The truth is that terrorism is super complex. It cannot be reduced to a single cause or pathway that explains all individual and group engagement in political violence. But we also know that some folks do join terrorist groups. Some folks do engage in terrorist activities and commit political violence, and others don't. So how can we make sense of this complexity, while also trying to identify the conditions that make political violence more or less likely? Well, some have argued that we must distinguish between the preconditions of terrorism and the precipitants of terrorism, which must further be distinguished at the individual and group levels. Preconditions of terrorism are the social structural conditions, characteristics, features, and environment that make terrorism more or less likely in the longer term. Think of the systematic discrimination and oppression by governments of a specific group or groups of people, or the organization of society based on a class structure that lets poverty run rampant. Precipitants of terrorism are the more micro-level, specific events or phenomena that immediately precede or trigger terrorist activity. Think of important or provocative events like a presidential election or a life-altering global pandemic that causes mass unemployment, isolation, and social alienation. These antecedent facts can then be further distinguished and analyzed at the individual and group levels. By focusing on the specific preconditions and the precipitants of micro-level engagement with political violence, rather than presenting broad root cause models or pathway models of terrorism in general, we can allow for complexity to be built into our analytic model. The root causes of terrorism are different for different people. The motivations of a group like Colombia's FARC are very different than the motivations of a neo-Nazi group in North America. And we must, as critical sociologists, analyze terrorism as such. Sociologists, of course, tend to focus on the link between individual agency that conditions structure and the structural factors that in turn condition agency. This has led sociologists to study the relationship between socio-political and economic factors, such as poverty, lack of economic opportunity, social isolation and alienation, political polarization, and so on, and engagement with terrorist activity. While the direct causal connection between these factors and terrorism is often found to be weak, a number of sociologists have highlighted that there are strong latent or indirect associations between social and economic inequality and the preconditions and the precipitants of political violence. For example, sociologists have long identified how lack of economic security leads folks to take on riskier and riskier employment opportunities, often against one's desire. If an individual has few to no job opportunities presented in the labor market, a terrorist organization might offer stable income for work. Individuals may be more likely to join that group, which can then lead to indoctrination by the echo chamber of that group membership. We also know from sociology in general that economic inequality is associated with increased political polarization, which may result in the adoption and uptake of more so-called extremist ideas. Deepak Gupta asks us to consider why some people participating in collective action in general, and terrorist action in particular, what are the rationalities and motivations for joining terrorist organizations and being involved in violent action, frequently at great personal cost. Gupta points to the importance of ideology and the role of political entrepreneurs, similar to Becker's concept of moral entrepreneurs, in providing prospective terrorists with a coherent motivation. However, in any movement, we find that different types of participants are involved for very different reasons. Some are quote-unquote true believers, motivated by ideology and cause. Others are mercenaries who are in it for their own selfish interests. Whereas a third type are captive participants who are involved for fear of not going along with the group or coerced into participation due to economic or social ties. In this way, singular pathway models are incapable of offering nuanced understanding of the complexities that drive individuals towards political violence. So rather than trying to engage in case studies of micro-level trends of terrorist activity, scholars should focus on specific, context-based analysis of individual transitions towards violence, and perhaps more importantly for Gupta, on why and how individuals desist, leave terrorism, or change their views altogether. But there are consequences to shifting away from the identification of root causes to describe and explain terrorism as a general phenomenon. There are really important and fundamental methodological questions that stem from an approach that accepts and necessitates complexity and nuance. And these are the questions that you must consider as a sociologist interested in studying terrorism. For example, the root cause model, while much more broad than I am about to describe, tends to propose that we can and should study terrorism as a dependent variable by seeking out explanatory or independent variables that have a causal relationship with terrorist activity. This is typically done with big N, or large sample case studies, of terrorist incidents labeled as such by various government authorities. One of the significant challenges with this approach is that it often relies on analysis of events labeled or defined as terrorism by governments. So what about the forms of political violence not labeled as terrorism? What about those perpetuated by individuals or groups not identified as a quote-unquote terrorist organization or terrorist entity? Do we just ignore those? How would that impact our model? Would it conflate the association between certain explanatory variables, say religious beliefs, and terrorism? Others have focused on geopolitical variables by focusing on the characteristics of societies from which terrorist organizations tend to emerge or are based. Again, I think you can point to some of the problems with scholars from the Western world using geopolitical factors, human development indices, or types of government rule as explanatory variables in the analysis of terrorism. If only certain groups in certain places are even defined as terrorism, that would inevitably bias your sample, regardless of the sample size. I want to be clear, not all scholarship in this area does this or is illegitimate. There are a number of scholars seeking to control for definitional differences in their analysis of terrorist organizations. However, sociologists continue to urge for the shift away from attempts to find grand narratives about terrorism and instead focus on micro-level analysis that may not be as generalizable to the broader population in the same way, but can give us nuanced and robust evidence of specific preconditions that influence individual and group transitions towards political violence. Contemporary sociologists of terrorism thus urge us to consider things like qualitative interview and ethnography-based studies with current and former extremists, those who have desisted from political movements, families of those involved in terrorism, victims of terrorist activities, group leaders, and so on. These lower-end sample size studies have their own faults. They lack generalizability, and they have an inability to offer broad suggestions for the development of counterterrorism policies and practices. But what they do offer are nuanced understandings of the specific and contextualized motivations, beliefs, ideologies, and practices of those undergoing a social process that may or may not lead to political violence. Enough studies like this can then be used to identify common trends and patterns, and can then be used to inform public policy. So building on the responses you gave in the last topic, I want you to propose a research question in the field of terrorism studies that you could answer empirically. In constructing your research question, consider a specific topic that piques your interest in this course and in terrorism more generally. If you have a specific question in mind that you've already developed, go a little bit further with it by pondering the type of study you could use to answer it. Is it a big N study of a particular data source? Is it an interview-based study of a particular group of people? Start thinking through the ways in which you might answer your research question and use the course material for this topic to think through some of the consequences of those decisions. What could be answered by your chosen study? What would remain unanswered? What are some of the implications of the type of study you are proposing? Putting a lot of thought into your responses here will certainly help you as you work towards your final project. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about the so-called root causes of terrorism and the complexity that we must approach this topic with. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Sociology of Terrorism.